collaborative effort involving all these names on the slide. So I think we mopped up pretty much everyone working on cats in the country. And as well as that, I think it's quite an unusual attempt to map the distribution of a really significant threat to our biodiversity at a continental scale. And it's worth starting off with the question, well, why do we need to know how many cats there are in Australia? And I think there's really three related answers to that question. Firstly, cats are obviously the subject of high-profile public policy now, and I think if you're going to have that sort of policy, it needs to be based on a sound evidence base, and at the moment that's not the case. And secondly, I think for ongoing research and management efforts, having those basic stats on the average density of cats and how that varies across the continent, that's just fundamental information that you need to know. And then thirdly, there's very strong public interest in cats now, and that's helped to drive the policy position that we have. But that interest has been, to a large extent, based on really strong messaging over the past several years about there being 15 to 20 million cats. The trouble is, whenever you drill down through all the various references to that figure back to the source, you get to the same point, and it's a speech given by the Honourable Bob Walker in the New South Wales Parliament in 1993 that got taken up, reported in some media, became fact. Now, presumably he had some advice to get that figure, but we don't know what that advice was. So essentially that figure is unsubstantiated. And I think that's becoming the Achilles heel for the policy position, because the fact that the estimate's dodgy is out there, people know about it. So you can click on any number of online blogs and discussion groups about cats, there's lots, and you'll see quotes like this. Scientists have no idea how many cats are in the country. If the science about cats is unreliable, why are we talking about a war on cats? There's no justification for a war of cats based on shaky science. To some extent, they have a point. So we really wanted to plug this, this information gap, I guess. So our aims were quite simple. We wanted to gather all the site-based cat density estimates from around the country that we could, and then use that information to come up with an estimate for the total population size in the country, and then also have a look to see what explains some of the variation in cat density across the continent. So we had to start by, I guess, defining the area of interest. So where are cats present in Australia? Where are they absent from? And in fact, they're only absent from two places. One is mainland fenced areas. So these are places that have been built specifically to exclude cats and foxes and protect threatened mammals. There are 16 of these at present. They cover 273 square k's, which is a tiny fraction of the Australian land area. On top of that, cats are absent from some islands. So there's about 8,000 odd islands in Australia. We know that cats are absent from about 600. And then there's another 3,400 islands that are over a hectare in size that cats may be absent from. So if you take the upper edge of that potential estimate, you're talking still about only a maximum of 0.1% of the Australian land area. You put the two figures in red together, and then you're finding that way less than 0.2% of Australia is free of cats. So that's a tiny, tiny number. So for the majority of the country that do have cats, how many are there? And we split our analysis into two. We looked at cats in the scrub, basically, and cats in urban and heavily modified environments. And I'll explain why we needed to do those two analyses separately when I get to part two. So starting with cats in the scrub, we were able to gather in 83 different site-based estimates for cat density across the country, and the dots show you the locations for those estimates. That was a much higher number than we expected, and in fact most of that information isn't published. So it's estimates that people have generated quite recently. But we got a good spread, and for each of those site density estimates we were also described the site as whether it was on a mainland, island, and just a variety of different climatic, environmental, land use factors. We then had to run 3 sets of models, and the reason we had to do that is we know that cat numbers in the inland of Australia fluctuate really strongly in response to rainfall. So we ran one set of models only using estimates that had been collected during dry periods, another set of models using estimates that had been collected after extensive rain, and then a third set with everything combined. So I'm just going to go straight through to the results. So feral cats in the scrub, we estimate in dry times there's 1.4 million, and after extensive rainfall, that figure goes up to 5.6. You can see the confidence limits there are reasonably tight, a bit bigger for the wet period. So we're talking about cat densities ranging from 0.2 cats per square K up to about 0.7 after extensive rain. We then looked at whether any of these variables affected cat density. And in fact, only the top two did. Now, I'm not saying that these variables aren't important for cat density at a smaller scale, like a regional or a local scale, but when you're looking across the continent, any impacts they have get swamped by other things. So I'll just show you how the two top variables did affect density. Cat density on islands is much bigger than cat density on the mainland. But bear in mind, because the size of the mainland is so much greater than the total area of islands, the majority of our cats are still on the mainland, despite what it looks like from that graph. And then on top of that, smaller islands, so smaller going that way, have higher cat densities. And actually that's not very surprising, because small islands often have seabird colonies, and that's basically just a fast food outlet for cats. They've got a bigger perimeter to area ratio, and lots of things are washing up on the beaches that cats can eat. And they're also less likely to have large predators like dingoes. So that result there isn't too surprising. The second important predictor of density was the mean annual rainfall at the site. And this is a bit of a surprising result initially, I suppose, but what we found is that in the drier parts of Australia, so inland Australia, cat densities are higher than on the wetter coastal fringe. But that effect disappears when you only look at estimates made during dry periods. So what we're saying is that with respect to the mean rainfall at the site, cat density across the continent is pretty even, but when you get those really big rainy periods in inland Australia, the cat density goes up, and then when conditions dry out, it comes back down again. So this map just summarizes the distribution of densities across the continent, and it's just telling you the same thing. Higher cat densities in inland Australia, lower cat densities where rainfall's higher in the tropics and on the eastern seaboard, and higher cat densities on the islands. So moving on to cats in heavily modified environments, some people would call these strays, I suppose. The reason we had to do this differently is because, for a start, there are fewer data available, but more importantly, cat distribution in these environments is hypervariable. So generally speaking, you've got a really high or a higher background density of cats that are surviving off introduced rodents, feral pigeons and so on. And then on top of that, you've got colonies at specific sites that have really high food subsidies, like dumps, intensive farms, chicken farms, and so on. So we needed to collect information on both types of cats. So we did a big literature search, and to cut a long story short, we found that the background density of feral cats in towns and so on was about 8 per square kilometre. And of course, you can multiply that by the area of Australia that's heavily modified. And using land use data, we found that there's over 10,000 sites that could potentially support colonies, so 10,000 dumps and intensive farms, and we know that the mean colony size is 26. It can reach several dozen, but the mean is 26. So you can do the maths, and you come up with a total number of cats of a bit over 700,000, with quite a generous range, as you can see. So you put the scrub cats and the stray cats together, and what we're saying is the cat population in Australia varies from 2.1 to 6.3 million, depending on weather conditions. And just for context, we know that there's a bit over 3 million domestic cats, so pet cats, in the country as well. So it's worth comparing that density estimate to estimates that have been produced from similarly size, so big regions elsewhere in the world. And in fact, there's only 3 comparable estimates, and they're there. And there's really 2 points that I want to make from this slide. One is that our estimate is unusually data-rich. So whereas our estimate is based on 83 point locations, you take the estimate from the States, for example, and that was modeled just from 5 field studies. So that's unusual. And the second point is that the cat density in Australia is a lot lower than the cat density that's been reported from other places. So I think it's about 15 times less than the UK one, for instance. And I think, there's a couple of obvious reasons for that. Like, we don't have, away from the urban areas, the density of farms in Australia is much lower. So farms support higher cat populations. And also, Australia is characterized by low productivity. So it's not surprising that a population of one of the top predators is also small. But although their density is low, we know that their impacts have been enormous and bigger here than in other regions of the world. We know that cats have been the primary drivers of about 2/3 of our 30-odd mammal extinctions. And we also plotted our cat density, our predictions for cat density, against the faunal attrition index. So this index, Andrew Burbage and his colleagues constructed this, but they took the mammal fauna for every bioregion in the country and calculated how much of that fauna had been lost since European colonization. So that's summarized in that top map. So more mammal species lost from the south of the continent. And you can see that that map actually matches our cat density map quite well, which is why we get this really tight relationship between cat density and faunal attrition. Now, we're not saying that this is causal, but it's a pretty interesting relationship. Okay, so I think there are 4, just to wrap up, there are 4 key implications from this study. The first is I think our work really reinforces that the impact of cats in Australia have been particularly severe because we've got very low density, very high consequence. I think we've demonstrated that a tiny fraction of Australia is cat-free, but that fraction has incredible conservation value. So some of our mammal species now only exist in that tiny fraction of Australia that's cat-free. Obviously, our new population estimate is much lower than the estimates that were being bandied around previously, but at least now I hope we can say that that estimate's not based on shaky science, it's based on relatively robust science. And the key thing, of course, is the cat impacts remain unchanged. The damage that cats have done is exactly the same today as it was yesterday. So if anything, the impact per cat has increased. And I guess the fourth implication is that the cull target in the threatened species strategy of 2 million cats is a stretch goal. It would be amazing if we did achieve it, but it doesn't look very likely when you're talking about a total cat population that's hovering just above 2 million. But I don't think that that's actually necessarily all that important, because the key aims of the strategy, which are all about species recovery, they can still be achieved. The point is that you take the emphasis off how many cats you're killing and put the emphasis on killing the right cats in the right time, in the right place. And at least now, all our ongoing research, management, and policy decisions can be made in the context of a much better understanding of the average cat density in the continent and how that density varies geographically.